Assalamu alaikum, everyone, and welcome to the Project Ahya podcast. Today, I'm excited to welcome Dr. Arya Nakisa. Welcome to the podcast, Dr. Arya.
Walaikum assalam. I'm very happy to be here.
Thank you very much. So, for those of you who don't know Dr. Arya, he's a scholar of law and religion. He obtained his PhD from Harvard University, and he was a professor at Washington University in St. Louis. Currently, he teaches at the Indonesian International Islamic University. And Dr. Arya's main interest is law and religion in Muslim societies in the pre-modern and modern periods. He's specifically very interested in colonization and its connection with education and the transmission of knowledge in the Muslim world. Dr. Arya has a wonderful article in which he examines how post-colonial liberal states regulate religion through a comparative study of government-run Islamic universities. I highly recommend it. This series by Dr. Arya aims to go deep into this topic and examine Islamic education across the Muslim world. So, Dr. Arya, would you like to introduce the series to us?
I feel very privileged to have this opportunity to share some of the results of my ongoing research. I think that Musab gave a very good, some very good introductory remarks on the nature of this project, and I can add a little bit more. So basically, what I'm trying to do is understand the transformation of Islamic educational institutions over the past 200 years across the entire Muslim world. And as many of you might know, the Muslim world, there are 5 major regions of the Muslim world. So one is the Middle East and North Africa. One is Sub-Saharan Africa. An additional region is Central Asia. A further region is South Asia. And then an additional region is Southeast Asia. So currently, you have a lot of scholarship where people will look at the transformation of Islamic educational institutions in one country or maybe one region, but they don't try and present an overall global perspective. But what we're going to do in this series is present a global perspective on the transformation of Islamic education across all 5 of these regions. And we're going to look at the impact of colonialism, both classical European colonialism in its British, French, and Dutch forms. And also, to some extent, we'll look at the impact of Soviet communism, which is going to be especially important when we talk about Central Asia and Southeastern Europe. And one of the other things that we're going to be doing, which I think is pretty interesting, is we're going to look at the most specific and we're going to look at the specific institutions in each region. So some people might want to know, what is Al-Azhar University? Or what is Medina University? Or what is Al-Qarawiyyin? Or what is Darul Uloom Deoband? Or what is International Islamic University Islamabad or International Islamic University Malaysia? And basically what we're going to do is we're going to systematically look region by region at the most important Islamic educational institutions, both the bigger universities and then just certain places that are known for training scholars these days. So for instance, we'll look at Mauritania, we'll look at Yemen, we'll look at all of these different regions. And I think the content that we're going to find anywhere else. So I'm really excited about it. Beyond that, I can go ahead and show you, maybe we can go ahead and start. I have some slides prepared that I hope will help make this clearer. And so our first slide here, overall, we're going to talk about the global transformation of Islamic education in the modern period. And actually, we're not going to be, this is a pretty big topic. So we're not going to be able to cover it in 15 minutes, 20 minutes. Basically, we have 6 episodes that we're going to use to cover all of this material. Today is going to be episode 1, but just to give you a taste or just to give you a sense of how the overall structure of the different 6 episodes that we're going to go over. So each of these episodes, I hope, will maybe be around 1.5 or 2 hours. Episode 1 is going to be an overall introduction to global religious reform. So over the past 200 years, all of the religions in the world Christianity, Buddhism, Hinduism, and Islam, they've all been transformed in terms of how they're understood, in terms of how they're taught. And our first episode is going to be dedicated to this overall global reform of religion and how it impacts Muslims. Then the second episode is going to be looking at the impact specifically of this reform trend on all of the different madrasas and later Islamic universities. So how does it change their understanding of knowledge? How does it alter the pedagogy, so the different techniques for teaching? How does it alter the curriculum? How does it alter the structure of these institutions? That is going to be the second episode. Then the third episode, we're going to look at all of the Islamic institutions, major educational institutions in the Middle East, from Al-Azhar to Qarawiyyin to Zaytuna to Mauritania to Yemen to Syria. We're going to look at all of that. Episode 4, we'll look at Islamic education in Turkey, kind of the center of the Ottoman Empire, and also Central Asia, where there is a big, which is impacted by communism. Episode 5, we'll look at Islamic education in South Asia. So that means India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and we'll also look at sub-Saharan Africa. So Nigeria, Senegal, Mali. And episode 6, we will look at Islamic education in Southeast Asia. So we'll look at Indonesia, we'll look at Malaysia, and then we'll also look at China and the impact of communist policies on Islamic education in China in places like Xinjiang and whatnot. So those are the 6 episodes that we will be going through in the upcoming weeks. But today we are going to start with episode 1, which is Islamic education and global religious reform in the modern period. So before I get started with that episode, I'll stop for a moment and ask if anyone has any comments or questions thus far.
Yeah, I mean, I guess some people might ask, okay, definitely reform happens. You know, a lot of times we think about reform, is it a positive thing, a negative thing, or why it's important? Maybe if you could touch on, why it's important to know and have an idea or some background or have a sense of this specific topic, because this isn't something that naturally comes to mind for a lot of people, right? They think that these are, these institutions are running in a particular way from their inception, or does it impact how it impacts sort of their guiding philosophy and things like that. So I guess kind of the importance of the topic at hand itself.
Okay, generally speaking, when people think about what Islam says about this or that issue, they are relying on, to some extent, on books and religious scholars. And what the religious scholars say depends on their education. And the educational system has a very deep impact on what we consider to be part of the Islamic tradition, what we consider to be part of the canon, what we consider to be authoritative Islamic knowledge, and what we consider not to be important. And beyond that, even in addition to determining the sources of Islam, it also determines how to interpret those sources. So let me give you an example. Many people would say part of the Islamic canon is the Quran. And then after that, the hadith. But which hadith do we have to pay attention to? Is it only mutawatir hadith? Is it sahih hadith? What about hasan hadith? What about da'if hadith? Is one a deviant if they say most of the hadith in Bukhari we shouldn't take them into account when we're trying to make fiqh decisions? Beyond that, let's even assume that we accept the Quran and we accept the hadith. What about the opinions of scholars? Do we have an obligation to defer to the opinion of scholars when we interpret the Quran and Hadith? So, for instance, in matters of fiqh, do we pay attention to the 4 legal schools? In matters of aqidah, do we pay attention to the opinions of, let's say, the Asharites, the Maturidites, and the Ahlul Hadith? in matters of Sufism. What are legitimate forms of Sufism? So for instance, is Naqshbandi Sufism legitimate? Is Mevlevi Sufism legitimate? Is Bektashi Sufism legitimate? These all depend on what is taught in the educational system. So for instance, you can be taught that, and historically Muslims have had big debates. This isn't only an issue in the modern period, this is an issue in the pre-modern period. So to give you an example, Muslim scholars there are all of these movements that happened between the 18th and the 19th centuries involving figures like Shah Waliullah ad-Dahlawi, involving figures like Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab, involving figures like Uthman Dan Fodio in West Africa. And one of the things that they're debating is what kind of texts and what kind of ideas are acceptable in Islam. So for instance, if you have ideas from Ibn Arabi, like Wahdat al-Wujud or An-Nur al-Muhammadi, or you have practices like Istighatha or Tawassul, is this legitimate or not? Are books that teach this legitimate or not? Are we going to teach them in our madrasas? Yes or no? So even our basic assumption about what do I need to consider an authoritative source, generally speaking, what Muslims consider an authoritative source is based on what is taught in the schools. And throughout Muslim history, people have had debates over what exactly should be taught at the schools and what shouldn't be taught in the madrasas. Beyond that, we also have to ask how we interpret the sources. So for instance, when we're interpreting the Quran and Hadith, do we use qiyas? So for instance, imagine I have a Quranic verse and it says, don't drink alcohol. Does that imply that I shouldn't drink date wine? Does that imply that I shouldn't smoke marijuana or use cocaine? Someone might say, like maybe Dawood al-Zahiri, member of the Zahiri school, if the Zahiri school was taught, maybe someone would say only khamr is forbidden, but qiyas beyond khamr is not legitimate. Or someone might say, this is a famous example that is sometimes discussed. There is a hadith that says, do not urinate into a vessel and then make wudu from it. Okay, well, it doesn't mention defecating in the vessel. What if someone were to defecate in the vessel? Could you make wudu from it? This is based on how we interpret the sources. Like the question is, do we use qiyas? Moreover, in terms of deriving rules, what is the position, what is the status of khabar al-wahid? For instance, is a single sahih hadith sufficient to justify a ruling, or does the hadith have to be mutawatir? Or can we use da'if hadith to go ahead and justify positions? Beyond that, what about things like maslaha mursala? Am I allowed, if the Quran or the Hadith says something like amputate the hand of the thief, am I allowed to make the argument based on maslaha mursala or istislah? Am I allowed to argue, wait, the aim, if I think of the maqasid of the Sharia, the aim of chopping off the hand is hifth al-mal. It's to protect property. And in a 7th century Arabian context, the way to protect property is to chop off the hand. That's very effective. But maybe in our own day, the best way to protect property is to put up CCTV surveillance and also put people in jail. Maybe that's proven statistically to be a more effective method. Does that mean that I can abrogate the had punishment of saraqah, of theft, which says that I should cut off the hand? So these are all questions of what principles of interpretation are taught. Even if we agree upon a canon, even if we agree that the Quran, that the Hadith, that maybe the opinions of the 4 fiqh schools are authoritative sources that we need to take into account, how do we interpret the Quran? How do we interpret the Hadith? How do we interpret the doctrine of the fiqh schools? All of that depends on what is taught at these universities. And for that reason, it's a very contentious, it's a big political issue, and it has been over the past 200 years. Because if you want to transform people's understanding of Islam, you have to transform the universities. Why do people in Egypt living today understand Islam in a radically different way than they did in the 19th century? It is because Muhammad Abduh, along with the British, transformed Al-Azhar University? Why in an Indian context are there debates over, should we follow the ideas of Syed Ahmed Khan? People who agree with Syed Ahmed Khan do something like form Mohammedan Anglo-Oriental University. People who don't agree with Syed Ahmed Khan might say, well, we're not going to be able to protect our own understanding of Islam unless we establish an institution like Darul Uloom Deoband. If there are these institutions play a central role, if not the most important role, in preserving, transmitting, and communicating the meaning of Islam, not only to the masses, but to new generations of scholars.
Oh, Jazakallah khair. I mean, so that was just for the audience, just to get an idea that judging from the scope of things that were mentioned when it comes to canon, interpretation, doctrine, and even our modern understanding of a lot of different aspects of Islamic law and spirituality, etc. It all goes back to this idea of educational reform in the Muslim world. So I guess the conclusion is it is incredibly important for how we understand and how Islam is being played out in the modern world. Jazakallah khair for that, inshallah.
I wanted to add here is, subhanAllah, a lot of people, they'll choose a university because, let's say, the Arabic is good, or it's in, a particular city, or there may be many considerations, but they're they're thinking that all of these Islamic universities operate in a sort of a vacuum in which politics does not enter, right? And so what you're saying is basically we should be aware of who's shaping the curriculum, and we should be aware of what direction they're taking us. And a lot of times, that is, to be in line with certain policies, or, like government policies and whatnot. So Jazakallah khair for that.
That's an incredibly important consideration. Inshallah, if we can jump into the slide so we don't, miss out on the details now. So Bismillah, go ahead.
Yeah, sure. So we'll go ahead and move forward. But I would just like to comment on what Mus'ab said. Put aside the issue of, so the point here that I'm trying to make is not what governments do to educational institutions with educational institutions, that it's a good or a bad thing. I'm simply saying that if one wants to understand, if one wants to have a understanding of the different forms of Islam and the different forces at play, one needs to recognize that, in fact, political and social change, political and social projects that to some extent emerge from within the Muslim world, to some extent emerge from the colonial powers, having an incredibly important impact on how Muslims understand Islam. But we're in a situation where most people aren't aware of the nature of this impact. They have so many assumptions about what Islam says, what the Islamic sources are, how to interpret them, and they don't ask how we got to the point where we are today. So rather than saying, so in terms of deciding where we are today, is this a good or a bad thing? What happened? Was it good or bad? We can go ahead and even bracket that issue. Let's begin the conversation. Let's make sure that we can have an informed conversation so we can actually know what's happened. And then that will put us in a better position to evaluate things and decide how to move forward.
Inshallah, yeah.
Okay. So if we're going to talk about modern Islamic education, we have to talk about the nature of the modern world. And the modern world is a world which has really been transformed over the past 2 to 3 centuries by events that happened in Europe and which are tied to the European Enlightenment. So the European Enlightenment happened, maybe you could say around 1650 to 1800. But especially the 18th century is key for the Enlightenment. And at the core, and what happens in Enlightenment Europe is there is the emergence of what we would call liberal ideology, liberal ideas. So what is liberal ideology? Liberal ideology is an ideology. It's an understanding of the world that centers on a particular idea. And that idea is civilizational progress. And the idea is that all human societies throughout history develop in a particular direction. Over time, they achieve ever higher levels of scientific and moral progress, and that is a good thing. So, what do we mean when we talk about scientific progress? Scientific progress means over time, there is a continuous increase in scientific knowledge. So now we know more about chemistry than we did 50 years ago, and 50 years in the future, we'll know even more about chemistry. And the same is true of biology, and the same is true of engineering. And moreover, this ever increasing scientific knowledge automatically results in ever increasing technological advances and economic output, in the sense that we can produce new and better goods and services. So when we learn more about biology, all of a sudden we can come up with cures for polio or cancer or COVID or HIV, the more that we learn about biology. And the more that we learn about chemistry or physics and engineering, all of a sudden we can make better communication devices. Like you can go from a regular phone, maybe you can go from a telegraph to a landline to a cell phone to a smartphone to maybe in the future like a brain implant. And there's no end. So basically, there's no end to the accumulation of scientific knowledge. Over time, you can accumulate basically infinite and increasing scientific knowledge, and that opens up the door to technological advances without end, and also increases in economic output. So maybe per capita GDP every year is going to increase more and more and more because of new technological breakthroughs based on continuing research and development. So that's really scientific progress. There's another type of progress. So one type of progress is scientific progress. There's also a notion of moral progress, and moral progress is conceived by liberal Enlightenment thinkers, figures like, John Locke or Jean-Jacques Rousseau, or a little bit later, John Stuart Mill. It's thought about by these figures, or Jeremy Bentham. Moral progress is about continuously increasing human happiness and continuously decreasing human suffering. And there's an assumption that there's a particular way in which we can increase human happiness and decrease human suffering. One of the things that we can do to increase human happiness and decrease human suffering is to give people ever more freedom, ever more rights in the form of freedom, in the forms of freedom. So we say, in the past, you had an obligation to pray 5 times a day and fast Ramadan. But guess what? Now we have a secular government that says there are no religious laws, and you can choose whether or not to fast or whether or not to pray. And that gives you more freedom. And also, we're going to give you all kinds of sexual freedoms. And also, we're going to abolish slavery. And that's going to give people more freedom. We're going to abolish serfdom as well. This is going to give individuals more and more freedom and more choice in their life, because one of the things that makes people sad is restrictions on their freedom. And beyond that, another thing that makes people very sad is inequality, discrimination. So we're going to remove discriminatory laws that say, for instance, the king and the aristocracy have a say in government, but the common people don't have a say in government. Or laws which make children obey their parents, especially after the children are adults. Or laws that make women obey men. Or laws that make, slaves obey their master. Or laws that make one race obey another race. All of these different laws that produce inequality, we're going to remove them. We're going to we're going to constantly alter the laws in our society, and we're going to reform the laws to give people ever more freedom and equality. And when we talk, so that's what moral progress is. Today, moral progress is really associated with what we'd call international human rights. So people are going to constantly come up with new human rights, new freedoms, and removing new forms of discrimination. Maybe like the type of human rights that are common in our days, are very closely tied to maybe sexual liberation and LGBT. But the idea is constant new rights, constant removal of discrimination. And when we talk about civilizational progress, so for liberal ideology, for 18th century liberal ideology, what civilizational progress is this combination of scientific progress and moral progress. Scientific progress and moral progress, that's what civilizational progress is. Now, today we don't call civilizational progress. Instead, we call it modernization. Instead, we call it development or international development. These terms are very common at the United Nations. They're very common in international relations more generally. Things were different before World War I. Before World War I, the way that people would refer to this is a civilizing mission and spreading civilizational progress across the world. However, after World War II, people stopped using the term civilizational progress because it was associated with colonialism. They said, before World War II, they said, we have a civilizing mission. We have a white man's burden to bring civilizational progress across the world. And that was tied to different colonial invasions of different countries. So people said, okay, we can keep the ideal of civilizational progress, but instead of calling it civilizational progress, let's call it international development instead.
So wouldn't you say,
Go
just on the point of civilizational progress, wouldn't you say that it's not only moral and it's not only scientific, but there's also like an epistemological component to it. There's an ontological component to it as well, and maybe even more importantly, there's a theological component to it as well, right? Like in terms of the entire civilization or the worldview, what we see is that the moral and the scientific is not independent of kind of the theological underpinnings, right? For example, like what questions do we have regarding God, or what beliefs do we have, what underlying notions do we have about God, and so on and so forth. Those, I wouldn't say that they're like independent of, the scientific or moral progress. Wouldn't you agree with that?
Yeah, very much so. I mean, scientific progress basically presumes a materialist, atheist, empirical worldview. I mean, pre-modern religions, including Islam, basically assume that a very important part of reality, or the most important part of reality, is hidden. It's unseen. It's not accessible to empirical observation. So the deepest truths are part of the unseen realm. They're part of the ghaib. They involve Allah and angels and heaven and hell. And the notion of scientific progress basically says none of these things are real. None of these knowledge about the ghaib, there's no such thing as knowledge about the ghaib. In fact, these are all things that people just hold on to because of tradition. And it would be better if we remove concern with religion and the unseen realm from society, and more importantly, from the educational system. And we need to teach people from the time that they're young. So oftentimes we think of Western education as neutral, like we might say, okay, in the United States or Canada, maybe the educational system is neutral. But when the educational system teaches you that the only way to establish that something is real, the only way to establish that something is a fact is through the scientific method or through empirical observation, the implication is that all religions are false. Like if they taught at university that no, maybe human beings have a fitrah that calls them to belief in one God, or if human beings, for instance, maybe have access to certain forms of mystic experiences like that might produce ma'rifah, that's a radically different notion of reality. And in fact, as we will see, traditional madrasas are structured in precisely this way. Also, traditional madrasas are structured along the lines of there's this idea that in terms of truth is not something that is reduced to empirical observation. So yeah, empirical observation is a source of knowledge about the world, but it's not necessarily the only source. There is an idea that it is good or perhaps unavoidable that many of our assumptions about the world are based on our upbringing, and we will always be shaped by our upbringing and our history. And the question is, how are we brought up? What is going to shape our minds and our rational faculties and our basic assumptions about the world? So to put it in summary, I very much agree with you.
Yeah, and the other thing also that I wanted to note is that there's a kind of almost overt and like explicit assumption in the masses that colonialism is a thing of the past. The white man's burden is a thing of the past, and these are all things that we've kind of gotten over. That's a racist idea. So after the creation of the UN, basically after the world wars, we don't really have this idea of colonization anymore. However, we see kind of like neo-colonialist projects, right? They might not operate the same way. They might not have this kind of overt military, and even maybe in some instances it does, but you might have a more like economic and more of kind of international relations pressures that are used to still advance this civilizational progress. So even though we don't see this kind of overt colonialism, but I would say that the common factor that did exist and that does still exist is this belief in this civilizational progress, that it must happen, whether it's a thing of the past or whether it's a present thing. There's still this kind of like strong arming that does exist when there's a clash of worldviews in different shapes and forms. Obviously, there are newer forms that exist today, but I think there's this kind of understanding, this underlying assumption that exists in the masses that colonialism is a thing of the past, and we're past these things. But we do still see this common idea that you brought up, civilizational progress. We do still see it persist.
Yeah, I mean, once again, this is a point where I'm guilty of agreeing with you. I fully agree. I mean, I think people make a mistake that power and influence in the world is determined by what's written on a piece of paper. So maybe you can have a UN declaration after World War II. Every country has sovereignty, every country has self-determination in terms of its educational system and its laws and its government policies. But people actually, and in fact, many of them during the Enlightenment, were quite aware that in reality, what determines whether a country is independent in the modern period is levels of scientific knowledge, technology, and economic power. Because you can force a person to do anything, or usually, as a general principle, you can force a person to do anything with two things. One is a threat, like you can put a gun to their head. Like if I wanted someone to mow my lawn or make me a pizza, there are two ways I can do that. I can put a gun to their head and say, make me a pizza or I'm going to shoot you. Or number two, I can say to them, I will pay you $5 to make me a pizza. Okay, no, what about $10? What about $1 million? And eventually they will do. What power is being able to get someone to carry out your will. And you can always do that through threats and offering benefits. Now, what science and technology and the production of increasing amounts of goods and services does is it enables you to make bigger threats. So you can threaten them by saying, I have tanks and Gatling guns and nukes, and on top of that, I have blackmail on you because I've been surveilling all your communications. That's how I can threaten you, the masses of people in different countries. And also in reality, they're government officials. Or number two, I just offer you money. I say, look, do you want a grant? Do you want an IMF loan? Do you want access to our markets? Do you want investment? Do you want foreign investment from our countries? These are all things that I can offer you. But in order to get these things, you have to do things for me. Like maybe you have to apply some new ideas of human rights that I endorse. Or you have to go ahead and shun and sanction some country that I don't like that is promoting a non-liberal worldview. So you're not allowed to cooperate with Russia. You're not allowed to cooperate with China. All of that doesn't depend on what is written on a piece of paper. The countries that have the biggest economies, the most science and technology and economic power, they are able, regardless of what's written on a UN charter, to approach other countries and say, do you want these? Based on these threats and based on these offers of benefit, you're going to do what we say. And the only countries that are able to resist are countries themselves who have a pretty strong economy or a pretty strong military, like China is a great example today, but also Russia to some extent has some degree of sovereignty. Also, you look at Middle Eastern states, so the Middle Eastern states that have some level of sovereignty would be Israel, obviously, Turkey to some degree, Iran to some degree, but many of the other states don't have the weaponry or the independent economy to go ahead and exert the same measure of independence. So,
without just dragging this part of the discussion out too much, but just the fact that, you know, every time you have the civilizational progress, you have more nations hypothetically gaining sovereignty. Wouldn't that be sort of a reason for them not to at least claim to want civilizational progress? Because then they can no longer, I guess, the bigger powers can no longer sort of control economic output or benefit, or take resources as they used to.
well,
You get what I'm
what's
saying?
important? Yeah, well, what is important is not the absolute amount of power that everyone has, the absolute amount of technology, but rather the comparative amount. So let's
Okay.
say hypothetically that all of the Muslim countries, for instance, in the world are getting militarily more powerful. Like if you compare Egypt or Pakistan in 1700 to 1800 to 1900 to 2000, getting progressively more powerful in the sense of having more guns and tanks and maybe in certain cases nukes. But the issue is not how much absolute power a country has. It's how much does it have compared to other
Mm.
countries. So the idea that many Western countries have is will allow other countries to grow their economic strength, will allow their countries to grow their military strength, but on the condition that there's still that we maintain a significant gap or even widen the gap between them and us. Now, you can have situations where that gap starts lessening and disappearing, sometimes because countries will develop weapons that undermine the gap. So, for instance, the most classical example is nuclear weapons. Another example would be hypersonic missile technologies. Those kind of negate a lot of the technological advantages that the West has, which is why there are limitations on who's allowed to develop those technologies. You can also have certain forms of economic growth, like economic growth in terms of computers and semiconductors and AI. And if the United States sees that there is a rising country of that type, like China, it will try and derail it to keep them subservient. So the US is okay with a rising China, a rising India, a rising Russia, rising Saudi Arabia, on the condition that a significant gap, so maybe all of these countries are increasing in their economic development, but the US has to be increasing at an equivalent rate or increasing the gap between them. Because as long as there's a gap, the US will be able to exert its military and economic power.
Okay. So it's about the comparative edge.
Yeah, comparative edge, comparative edge.
All right.
Okay, these are great questions. These are great questions, and they're really important for understanding the background of why certain countries can influence others. For instance, if the Europe did not have a comparative edge in terms of science and technology and economic production, no one would care what European thinkers think about. Like, yeah, they can have all these ideas about a scientific worldview. They can have all these ideas about human rights. Who cares? Who cares if we ignore them? What are they going to do about it? And in fact, that's what many of these countries tried to do. Like China and Japan just simply said, go away, Europe. We don't care. You're not allowed to even enter our harbors. Go away. Also, many of the Muslim countries also just tried to ignore Europe. But what happened is Napoleon said, I'm not going to be ignored. I'm going to invade your country. Or in Japan, you have gunboats In China, you have the Opium Wars. You have European powers saying, we're not going to let you ignore us. You're going to do what we say. You're not just going to focus on preserving your way of life, preserving your traditional forms of education. You're going to have to grapple with the power that we have the ability to threaten you and offer you benefits, and we're going to exert control over you.
Interesting.
Okay, so religious reform. So liberal ideology is based on the general notion that civilizational progress is a good thing and it should be promoted by people in society. It should also ideally be promoted by the government. In fact, the standard liberal notion is that the most important task of any government is to continuously keep the country moving forward, to bring progress, or what we today call bring development to the country. One thing that during the Enlightenment period that liberals recognize is that traditional forms of religion are often an obstacle to progress for a number of reasons, but the most obvious is that they contain many teachings which seem to conflict with progress. So they're filled with all of these teachings that seem to conflict with science. They're filled with all of these teachings that conflict with moral progress or human rights. Some liberal thinkers deal with this by saying, okay, we need to destroy all religions. So you have people like Condorcet and Diderot, maybe, who want to just say, we're atheists and let's destroy all religions. But that's a minority position. Most liberals will say, look, humans have a need for religion. It's not practical to destroy all religions. Maybe they have some even degree of religious faith themselves. This is quite common over the past 200 years. So they say the issue with religion is not to destroy it. It is simply to reform it. And what does religious reform mean? It means we're going to reinterpret. We're going to reinterpret scripture. We're going to reinterpret the Quran. We're going to reinterpret the Hadith. And we're also going to reinterpret doctrines. And maybe it seems that these scriptural texts and these doctrines conflict with science and human rights, but we're going to give a new interpretation. We're going to reinterpret them and prove through this reinterpretation that they actually endorse science and human rights, or scientific and moral progress. So to give you an example, traditional Islam, like traditional Christianity and traditional Hinduism, assert that miracles exist, that, for instance, Moses turned a stick into a snake, and that demons exist, jinn exist. Moreover, they adopt the kind of creationist worldview. They say Adam was made by God from clay. All of these conflict with scientific ideas, a scientific materialist worldview. I'm not saying that's a correct worldview, but one can say, even if one disagrees that it's a correct worldview, which all pre-modern religions do, it is at the very least clear that there is some kind of tension or conflict there.
One question.
So what
here.
does it mean? Oh, go ahead.
Sorry to interrupt. One question here. Like, was there a point where maybe some of the international powers tried to stamp out religion completely, and they saw that this is much more difficult than just internally reforming it? And so, like, for example, Stalin, right? He tried to stamp out Christianity in the Soviet Union, and do you think like there have been experiments in the past when it was like, instead of reforming, the idea was, okay, how do we totally get rid of all religious expression? But that didn't work out, for example, and therefore it's like, okay, let's just work on internal reform, and that's like a easier and more cost-effective way.
Yeah, I mean, the classical examples are the French Revolution. The French Revolution started out, it didn't say destroy. They said we're going to support a type of deism. We're going to support a type of rational religion, but they said all traditional religions must be destroyed for a period of time. For a period of time, like maybe in the 1780s or the 1790s. But then there was a backlash. They said this really isn't a possibility. This is not practical. The better example are the communist states. So, I mean, don't quote me on these exact dates because I'm saying this off the top of my head. But between the 1920s and the 1940s, there is this Stalinist terror, and they do try and abolish Orthodox Christianity, and they try and abolish Islam. In fact, in Albania, which is a communist country, they did actually completely ban Islam. They were the only communist country that went to an explicit ban on all religions. I believe that was in the 1940s or the 1950s. Another example is China. I think between the 1940s and the 1960s, they have these programs culminating in the Cultural Revolution that really try and destroy all religion. But in all of these cases, in one sense, they didn't work, but they really had a big impact. Like they fundamentally impacted religious traditions in all of these countries. For instance, post-communist Muslim countries like Central Europe, like Southeastern Europe, or Muslims in China have a radically different understanding of religion and attachment, much lower attachment to religion than Muslims in other parts of the world. And we know this through statistics. We know this because polling institutions like Pew will go into these countries and ask people questions like, rate on a scale of 1 to 10, what is your belief in God? How many times a week do you pray? Do you support Sharia law? What Sharia laws do you want to preserve? Rituals or family law or hudud? Do you believe in an Islamic government? And what you see is that in post-communist societies, the level of support for religion is way, way lower than Muslims in other places. I mean, generally speaking, if you talk about levels of religiosity in the Muslim world, those countries that were not formally colonized, all countries became colonized to some extent, but the general rule is that those countries that didn't go under full formal colonization have the highest levels of religiosity. Example, Saudi Arabia. Example, Afghanistan. This would be examples of that type. Then you go to countries that are colonized by the British. They have, comparatively speaking, a higher level of religiosity than countries that were colonized by the French, that took a harder line in suppressing religion, in keeping with ideals like laïcité. And then like communist-style governments really are the ones that lower permanently, or at least long-term, levels of religiosity. But these are all things that actually, it's interesting because we're going to discuss all of these, because these policies of the French and the British and the communists and those countries that escaped colonialism, like let's say, or escaped full-on colonialism, like let's say Saudi Arabia, Iran, Afghanistan, this is reflected in their educational institutions. Okay, so once again, great question.
Yes, thank you. And against that backdrop, can we say that ultimately the point of religious reform is the same? Like, it's to eradicate the soul of religion. One is to eradicate the body and the soul. The other is just, okay, keep the body there, but just remove the soul, for example.
Well, it depends on if you say liberal religious reform. So there are different types of religious reform. But if we talk about liberal religious reform, I would argue that in fact there are different liberal models. So you could, if you wanted to say like the most secular liberal, like fully, the issue is people who endorse liberal ideas, like people who want to spread a scientific worldview, or people who want to spread human rights. There are different levels of liberalism, and we find that in the Muslim world. So, for instance, some people, when they say I'm a liberal, what they mean is they say we don't want Islamic governance in the sense of hudud and in the sense of khilafah and those kind of rules. But we're okay with Islamic family law. We're okay with Islamic rituals. We're okay with Islamic beliefs. In fact, many Islamists, are of this type. Many of the groups that we call Islamist groups are actually quite liberal. So Ikhwan al-Muslimun is a very liberal group. Maududi has many liberal ideas. The Iranian Revolution has it's very rare. It's very, very rare that you will find an Islamic movement that hasn't consciously or unconsciously absorbed many liberal ideas. So I would say that if one absorbs 100% liberal ideas, then yeah, you move to a purely scientific worldview, pure secularism. And to the extent that you have Islam, it's simply an ethnic identity. And in fact, this was the conscious policy of communist states. They said, we're going to change Islam from being a religion to being an ethnic identity. It's going to be an ethnic identity marker. That's literally the policy of Albania. It's the policy of Soviet Russia. It's the policy of China. But then you have other people who have different levels of tolerance for religion. So some people will say Muslims can keep their family law. Other people say Muslims cannot keep their family law. We don't want Islamic family law, but we allow rituals and beliefs. And then some people say, no, we don't even want rituals, just keep the beliefs. And then some people say we don't even want beliefs, just reduce Islam to ethnic identity. These are the different levels of liberal reform that you find historically. So I would just say that when we think about the impact of liberalism and liberal religious reform, we shouldn't think in terms of dichotomy, like either you are liberalized, you do endorse civilizational progress, or you reject it as a whole. It's all a matter of degrees. It's all a matter of a spectrum. And that's actually how we can understand. That's very important for understanding what's taught at Islamic universities. So Islamic universities, generally speaking, you will find virtually none of them that say we completely reject progress. And you'll find virtually none of them that say, okay, we're full on secular liberal atheists either. What you always find is something in between. And usually it depends on what country you're talking about. Like what goes on in a communist country is different from what goes on in Turkey, which is different from what's going on in a British colonized country or French colonized country. But yeah, we'll have plenty of time to, inshallah, address these issues in the coming episodes where I can give you concrete examples. But these are good questions to ask. So when it comes to traditional Islam, there are all these beliefs like miracles and demons and creationism exists. But if you're a liberal reformist, you might say, okay, the Quran talks about jinn, but jinn are really just microbes. This is an opinion of Muhammad Abduh. Or jinn are just a metaphor for evil. This is a view of Syed Ahmed Khan. You could say miracles in the Quran don't really exist, or references to miracles are just references to coincidences. So, for instance, if the Quran describes Musa as splitting the Red Sea, that was just like a meteorological coincidence, like the wind blew and it spread the sea, but there was no violation of scientific laws. Or, for instance, if the Quran talks about Allah creating Adam from clay, that's a metaphor for Darwinian evolution. So on its face, you look at the Quran and it appears to have these beliefs that conflict with science, but religious reform is saying, no, wait, the Quran actually isn't against science. The Quran is a completely scientific text, or basically moves in that direction by eliminating one by one various non-scientific beliefs. That's not unique to Islam. The exact same thing happens with religious reform in Christianity and Hinduism and Buddhism. It's the same thing if we talk about tradition. So it's not only does this happen when it comes to scientific laws. Yeah, when we talk about religious reform and moral doctrines, there are also all kinds of moral teachings that are found in Islam and Christianity and Hinduism and Buddhism, for that matter. So you have slavery. All of these religions, whether you're talking about Islam, Christianity, Buddhism, for that matter, Hinduism, for that matter, they have slavery. There are blasphemy punishments. There's minor marriage. There's punishments for illicit consensual sex like adultery. All of these violate human rights from a Western liberal standpoint. So what does it mean to reform these religions? It means basically reinterpreting these texts and doctrines to assert that in reality, despite what the Quran appears to say, despite what the zahir of this text appears to say, actually the Quran and Hadith don't endorse slavery or blasphemy punishments or minor marriage or punishments for illicit sex. Maybe we need to look at the maqasid. We need to look at maslahah. So, maybe it appears that there's a punishment for adultery, but the aim of the adultery punishment is hif and nasab, and now we have DNA tests. So maybe it made sense for 7th century Arabia, but now we shouldn't have punishments of that type. It's that type of argumentation, and we see that literally with every religion, not just Islam. Like they have maslaha type arguments in Christianity and Judaism and Hinduism and Buddhism. They just look for terms from their tradition to justify it, but it's the same type of argumentation. So there are many examples we can give of Christian religious reform. Basically, the liberal governments and liberal political activists and thinkers began reforming Christianity between the 18th and 19th century. So they're interested in reforming Protestantism, Catholicism, Eastern Orthodoxy across Europe. And what do? You have a liberal politicians and liberal thinkers. So some of the most important liberal politicians would be like Frederick the Great of Prussia or Peter the Great of Russia. The most important maybe liberal politician would be Napoleon. Napoleon kind of wants to spread the teachings of the French Revolution across Europe, and for that reason conquers continental Europe. But all of these liberal politicians and liberal thinkers say the way that we reform religion is we appoint religious reformers, reform-minded religious intellectuals to the churches, to the charities, to the religious schools, to the seminaries, to the universities. So they say, how can we reform a religion? How can we reform Catholic Christianity? Let's make sure that when someone hears a sermon in the church, that the person preaching the sermon is giving a liberal reformed interpretation of the Bible. And let's make sure when they're teaching at a seminary, this is what they're teaching the next generation of priests. And let's make sure that at religious schools, this is what they're teaching the children. And let's make sure that people who are running charities, like for instance, soup kitchens or orphanages or hospitals, as like the church is doing at this time, that people in these positions of power and control are not going to resist the liberalization policy of the state, but they're going to endorse it. So we can talk about key Protestant Christian reformers like John Locke, or key Catholic Christian reformers like Antoine Adrien Lemaitre, or key Orthodox Christian reformers like Feofan Prokopovich. But that would take a lot of time. But I'm just saying, the kind of people that you encounter in Islam or Hinduism or Buddhism, the people that we start encountering in the Muslim world, before this happened, you have this happening with respect to the reform of Christianity and in a European context, and you have the same thing with the reform of Judaism. So if you talk about Judaism, you also have liberal reformers in the 18th, early 19th century, people like Abraham Geiger, and before him Moses Mendelssohn. All of them have the same ideas, because all of them basically say we need to reinterpret our religion so that they don't conflict with science and human rights. Okay.
Was that the driving factor behind the reform? Is it that it's going to stop civilizational progress?
Yeah, because here's what happens. People in all these societies, in European societies, for instance, they say that these scientific beliefs that you are teaching conflict with our religion, conflict with our Catholicism, conflict with our Protestantism, conflict with our Judaism. And moreover, these human rights teachings that you have conflict with the moral teachings of our religion. And in order to defend our religion, and also the religion is tied to the family structures, to the marital structures, to the ethnic identity, you always have some kind of backlash brewing And we'll talk more about that later on. In the 18th century, they said whenever you bring progress to a country, you always have to worry about extremism or radicalism, or what they called in the 18th century fanaticism. People saying, no, 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 we don't accept these changes to our schools and our churches and our government laws because it's going to lead to the end of our religion and our family life and our traditional identity. You always have this backlash building. So for instance, Catholics, traditionally the Catholic Church, if someone challenges the church or rejects church teachings, the Catholic Church calls for rebellion. Like the Catholic Church basically says the ruler is no longer entitled to rule. The ruler must subordinate himself to the Pope. And if the ruler doesn't agree, then he calls on the Christians in that country to rise up in a rebellion. So all of these countries face the danger of rebellion against this progressive project. And they said what's really leading this rebellion is religious fanaticism, like Christian religious fanatics, especially Catholics, especially Orthodox, to a lesser extent Protestants. And they said in order to prevent radicalization and fanatic rebellion against our liberal governments, we need to repress these groups. So, for instance, we need to ban fanatic speech. Many people have a bit of a misunderstanding about Enlightenment thought in the 18th and the 19th centuries. In the 18th and the 19th centuries, you don't have unlimited free speech. You don't have unlimited freedom to vote. You have limited free speech and limited freedom to vote. But if people start saying fanatic things, like we want to establish a Catholic theocracy, or that we want to punish blasphemy, those people are arrested or expelled or jailed, or they have their groups. So you might have, for instance, you have a Jesuit order. This is an order of Catholic priests that is very, very conservative. They say in all of these countries, we're banning the Jesuit order as an extremist group. Many people would laugh about this today, but the classical form of extremism is actually Catholic extremism. Catholic extremism, this is what the French Revolution was fighting against, because these Catholics kept rising up in armed revolt against the new Enlightenment government. There's actually a great book on this. I think that it's called Coping with Defeat. And it's by a scholar named Jonathan Lawrence. It's published by Princeton University Press. It's one of my favorite recent books. It's come out maybe in the past 5 years. And it basically talks about how in the 18th and the 19th centuries, like Europeans were very deeply concerned with combating Catholic fanaticism everywhere, like in France, Spain, Italy, Germany, and they basically had authoritarian liberal forms of government to stamp out this Catholic fanaticism. And he says there are parallels with liberal government projects now that are concerned with Islamic so-called fanaticism or radicalism. But all of this, whenever you have, and in fact, there were crackdowns also on Hindu extremism. Like, this is one of the oldest stories. Like, the British are very concerned with Hindus and Muslims rising up, like, let's say in the mid-19th century, the Sepoy Rebellion or other kind of forms of Hindu rebellion that happened later on. And in fact, the Indian state was cracking down on these groups. So it was saying, Hindutva, kind of what was his name? Nathuram Godse, the guy who killed Gandhi, like they will say, like, these are forms of Hindu fanaticism that we need to crack down on. Although it's interesting because actually those groups ended up taking control of the government now. So that's no longer considered to be like a fanatic movement. Or you have a similar thing with religious Zionism, like many of these groups. The groups that are associated with religious Zionism, like, let's say, Itamar Ben-Gvir and Bezalel Smotrich, these are initially illegal groups in Israel. But then just over time, they get elected. But one of the things that you find with all of these groups that they get elected, they will, they will still be concerned with stamping out what they call religious extremism, but they will say like, okay, we're concerned with stamping out Islamic religious extremism. So this is very common in Hindutva
I was going to ask,
discourse.
isn't it become an issue of being the right religion? Because even the colonists, they were bringing Christianity over to, you know, the lands they were colonizing. I mean, when they were actually dealing with, you know, Christianity was the problem for them in their own land, then why are they transporting it, you know,
missionary schools and whatnot,
missionary
like,
schools and what have you?
Oh, that's a really good question. The short answer is this. Right now, we live in a world with a lot of NGOs. NGOs play an enormous role in development work and spreading human rights. The predecessors of NGOs are missionary groups. In fact, the 19th century is known as kind of the century of missions, because traditionally, before colonialism, you have Muslim, Hindu, Chinese, Japanese government blocking the missionaries. They say, we don't want these missionaries. And there are reasons for that that are compelling, at least from a political perspective. They say it's been established that when people convert to Christianity, they ally with other Christians. So they ally with the European powers against us. So they all were banning Christianity, but then when Europe started conquering all of these lands, it said one of the first things that we want to do is establish freedom of religion, which meant that Christian missionary groups could operate. And they actually said that Christianity is a way of spreading civilizational progress. In fact, this is the standard argument. Why? Because they say that Christianity has already been reformed. It's maybe you've heard some of these arguments today, like Ayan Hirsi Ali or some of these other individuals. They'll say Christianity is a more liberal religion now. Christianity is a liberal-friendly religion. It's consistent with civilizational progress. And they have different arguments for this. Sometimes they just say it's simply because the liberalization process happened with Christianity first, earlier. Sometimes they'll say Christianity, by virtue of its structure, by virtue of, for instance, not having a code of religious laws like Sharia or Torah or Dharma, is inherently more open, is inherently more
susceptible,
accepting of liberal laws. So they actually saw spreading Christianity as spreading a liberal form of religion as kind of a vector or a tool to spread liberal values. Now, of course, that's not necessarily how the missionaries themselves thought about it. They thought that the version of religion that they were preaching was real Christianity, not like a liberalized version of Christianity. So in terms of their own thought, they thought like Jesus is always a libertarian. Like Jesus's message was not about renouncing the world and renouncing all of one's wealth and living the life of a monk. No, that Jesus was about saying, you know, no coercion in religion and tolerating, you know, whatever anyone does, tolerating however people live their lives. So basically, Jesus was spreading a secular libertarian message. No one had understood Jesus in this way throughout all of history, but this is the liberalized Jesus that emerges in the Enlightenment period at the hands of liberal Protestant reformers like Pierre Bayle and John Locke. It's basically like how many Muslims might be shocked to find that the Quran is, according to some scholars, according to some Muslim reformers, actually, Muhammad Soysan is in their view, a liberal reformer. Like the message of Islam is la ikrah fi din. Like that's basically why Islam was established, to bring religious freedom to the world, and the Quran is religious freedom text.
Can you translate la ikraha fi din?
No coercion in religion. Like that's the only verse that people will remember.
That's like the conclusion of.
Yeah, they will say like the Quran is a feminist text. Once again, you can read a text in any way, but this is a new understanding of the Quran. It is not a pre-modern understanding. It's a reinterpreted version of the Quran. And this is so you have like the liberal liberalized versions of all of these religious figures, whether you're talking about Jesus or Buddha or Muhammad Sallallahu, you have kind of a reinterpretation of their legacy. So if we're talking about how this colonial power gets projected, we can say that between the late 18th and mid 20th centuries, European liberals widen their objectives. Kind of in the 18th century, they say we need to bring progress and liberal religious reform to Europe, to the countries of Europe, to France, to Britain, to Spain, to Italy, to Germany. That's what we want to do. But when you talk about the late 18th to mid 20th centuries, liberal Europeans say we need to bring progress and religious reform to the entire world. And this is something that they call the civilizing mission. In French, my French pronunciation is terrible, mission civilisatrice, or the white man's burden. And this is actually the justification for constructing these vast colonial empires. So when you have Britain taking control of India or Egypt or Australia, they don't say we're taking control of these lands because we want to exploit the people or exploit the natural resources or anything like that. That's not what they say. They say we need to bring the benefits of civilization to these countries, to these people. We have a moral obligation to do so. And to be honest, I believe them. I'm not denying that they want material goods as well. I'm not denying that they want power as well. But in reality, the colonial project is a liberal project. The leading colonial powers are the paradigmatic liberal governments of France, of Britain, of Holland. These all establish vast colonial empires, and they say, what are we going to do? What is our option? If we don't colonize these countries, they're going to be starving. They're going to have famines. People aren't going to be healed. Like, they're going to have all these medical problems, and they're going to have all these plagues. Why? Because they don't have modern science and modern hospitals. They don't have modern technologies to produce enough food. That's one. So it's going to be a humanitarian disaster. Moreover, they have all these human rights violations. If we don't invade these countries, there's going to be slavery and corporal punishment. All of them are going to be doing a different type of human rights violation. So maybe the Muslims are going to be putting a jizya on the dhimmis and cutting off some hands. And then the Hindus are going to be doing widow burning, like kind of a sati thing, and caste oppression. And the Confucians are going to be doing foot binding and the death of 1,000 cuts, where they like cut your body up into very small pieces. You can look it up. In colonial newspapers, in colonial political activism of the 19th century, they're very concerned about how each religion, each specific religion and culture is basically full of human rights violations. So when they study Islam, if you say, okay, well, you know what Islam is really about? It's about, prayer and fasting and making pilgrimage and giving money to the poor and, being a good husband or wife and, being just in your business dealings. They say, no, we want to study the hudud. Like, we're not interested in that. Like, basically put together all the things that look like human rights violations, and that's what we want to study. So it's basically like a 19th century version of like a Tommy Robinson or Ian Hersey Ali website. Like, that's the type of understanding of Islam that is often promoted by these colonial governments. So they say we have no choice but to intervene and get these Hindus and Muslims and Buddhists and Confucians under control. In the Indian subcontinent, in the Middle East, in the Malaysian Peninsula, in parts of sub-Saharan Africa, especially Nigeria. The French control Muslims in North and West Africa, places like Algeria and Morocco and Senegal and Mali. And then the Dutch basically establish a colonial empire over Indonesia. And also so this is a picture of the British Empire. You can see they're controlling a lot of areas where there are Muslims here and here. And then you talk about the French Empire. It's basically North and West and kind of Central Africa. Lots of Muslims are living in these areas. You talk about the Dutch Empire. So basically they're controlling these Indonesian lands. This is where they are established. And they know that all of these people, whether they're talking about Muslims or Christians or Hindus or whatever, they say people aren't, even in Europe itself, in the 18th century, they say the population as a whole will not voluntarily accept this process of progress because they believe, they have an understanding that it will undermine their religious and cultural traditions. So basically, they're going to resist. So we need to use some measure of authoritarian rule, enlightened, in European context, they call it enlightened absolutism. You can Google that, you can read about that, enlightened absolutism, but it basically means liberal authoritarianism, liberal dictatorship. So they apply this. This is a very common policy in Europe, especially during the 18th century, culminating in Napoleon. He's like the most famous liberal dictator. But all of the colonial governments are basically liberal dictatorships that have been spread across the world. And the justification is spread civilizational progress, reform their religion so that these people stop resisting civilizational progress as somehow opposed to their religion. And in the meantime, we will need to, the way that we'll do that is we'll change their educational system, and we'll change their laws, and we'll change their customs. So
from a logical perspective, I was wondering, when you use the term liberal authoritarianism, isn't there some kind of like logical contradiction in that? I mean, the idea of liberty is that people should be free, right? People should have the freedom to choose, their laws. They should have the freedom to, adopt whatever culture they want and whatever kind of moral worldview they want to adopt. They should have that freedom. At the same time, we're also saying authoritarianism, which basically implies that, there's going to be some kind of, enforcement, some kind of forced change of laws, and so on and so forth. So, this whole like civilizational mission, isn't there some kind of internal cognitive dissonance that exists in it?
I guess it makes sense when you put it in the light of colonialism, right? They both come in harmony.
Yeah, I mean, even in a European context, I mean, this is a little bit of a misunderstanding of what liberal doctrine traditionally is, but it's important to address it because it's a very common misunderstanding. The key liberal notion is civilizational progress. And the idea is that we're going to keep making science, our goal is to make society as scientific and wealthy and free and equal as possible. We're going to keep moving it in that direction. That is our overall goal. Now, in certain cases, if the people as a whole, if the population as a whole is willing to use their free speech to argue in favor of more progress, more science, more freedom, more equality, great. We give them freedom of speech. If they are ready to vote for liberal parties, then we give them the right to vote. But if you go ahead and you have a population and they say, no, if you give us the right to speech, we're going to go ahead and criticize the liberal government, they'll say this is an extremist speech. This is hate speech. This is extremist speech. This is hate speech. It's going to get out of control. If you say we're going to let you vote and all of them want to vote in some Islamic party, they will say, no, we can't they're not ready for elections. They say the people aren't civilized enough. And in fact, this idea is very famously expressed in John Stuart Mill's a 19th century text on liberty. People know of John Stuart Mill as a famous liberal thinker, but he's also a very famous colonial administrator. He was a high colonial administrator in British India, and he's very explicit. So On Liberty is about maximizing individual freedom. And he says, we're going to maximize individual freedom as long as the people don't use that freedom to undermine the liberal project of moving in the direction of progress. If they haven't, if they have not themselves internalized this liberal project, if they do not support this liberal project, it proves that they're not civilized enough. They're not civilized enough to be given rights. You're only allowed to have rights once you become a liberal. If you're
There's
not a
something
liberal,
circular about this, no? There's something circular about this.
if you said, if someone thought, well, okay, well, what, okay, so the way that John Stuart Mill would say, okay, our goal is to maximize individual freedom. Now imagine people use their individual freedom, like let's say their freedom of speech, to call for a theocratic state, and they can convince everyone to institute a theocratic state. At the end of the day, yeah, you give them freedom of speech, but they use that freedom of speech to abrogate everyone's freedom of sexuality and freedom of religion, and really at the end of the day, their freedom of speech as well, because they want to go ahead and start instituting blasphemy laws. So John Stuart Mill would say, yeah, I concede that you have to give up some freedom, but our ultimate goal is not give everyone 100% freedom all the time. Our goal is to put India, or Ireland for that matter, on a trajectory where the freedom is increasing year by year by year. And in fact, this is also something that people misunderstand about European politics generally. When Europeans gave people, it wasn't just the period of enlightened absolutism and, Frederick of Prussia or Peter the Great or Napoleon that are going ahead and instituting liberal dictatorships. In reality, when they gave people the right to vote, people didn't just get the right to vote in 1700 or 1750 or 1800. They gradually expanded the right to vote over the 1700s, over the 1800s. They said the people who are not allowed to vote are uneducated, poor people from the countryside. Like the people who get the right to vote first are people who have studied at liberal universities. They're in the big cities, they're the bourgeoisie, because they are inclined the most towards liberal values. And then you gradually expand the right to vote to other people. But even today, if you have people and they start voting inappropriate things, you can still suspend their votes. Like you can say, you know what, you're not going to be allowed to talk in society because we have hate speech laws or extremism laws, or we're going to go ahead and use terms of service to restrict your speech on social media. And guess what? Even if you do vote for some laws that conflict with liberalism, guess what? We have the Supreme Court. We have a constitution, and we have a Supreme Court, and we have international law, and that will always, always, always override any popular vote. So that's like baked into the cake. You can vote for whatever you want, except you're not allowed to vote out international human rights norms, and you're not allowed to lessen international human rights norms. When you vote, you have two options, which is the Republican. You're all Americans, right? You're Americans?
Yeah. American, Canadian. Mufti Tafil is a Canadian.
Okay, but you're familiar with American culture.
Yeah,
Yeah, we're all American.
We're all American, yeah.
Your
North
options are Republican or Democrat. So Republican basically says, Democrat says legalize marijuana today. Republican says do it in 10 years. The question, you can't go ahead and say, okay, let's go ahead and ban things. Let's go ahead and ban alcohol. Let's go ahead and ban, various forms of sex. No. The question is just simply the speed of the liberalization process. You can go a little faster. You can go a little slower, but you're not allowed to go backwards. You're not allowed to say, you know what, we need a theocracy in the United States. We need, for instance, sex punishments in the United States. We need to reinstitute slavery in the United States. This is inconceivable. These are not, regardless of whether it's a good or a bad thing, this is not a liberal government is not one that ever says you're allowed to go backwards and reverse the process of progress. When you vote, you just vote, is it going to be a little faster or is it going to be a little slower? And if anyone votes to move in the other direction, the Supreme Court overrules, or they institute a state of emergency. And if any of you say, well, what is a state of emergency? Do you not know? Are you not aware? Or perhaps you are aware. Every single post-colonial Muslim state, like every ordinary liberal state, has a rule in its constitution. And that rule in the Constitution says that the government can declare a state of emergency and suspend all rights. So, for instance, maybe if there's COVID, if there's some kind of big danger or disaster, the government can say, everyone stay in your house. No one is allowed to spread stuff about, rumors about vaccines or anything else. There are limitations that you can put on speech in a state of emergency. The colonial governments declared throughout the entire colonial period a state of emergency. They said there's a state of emergency because these Hindus or Buddhists or Muslims are going to rise up in a colonial rebellion to defend their religious and cultural traditions. So it's a nonstop state of emergency, like Algeria. Algeria is a state of emergency 130 years. 1830 to 1960, nonstop state of emergency. And this isn't hidden. This, like Alexis de Tocqueville, famous liberal thinker, says, yeah, we need a nonstop state of emergency. People get confused. They look at Muslim majority countries today in any part of the world. They look at the Constitution. They say, hey, sounds like we're allowed to have free speech. It sounds like we're allowed to participate in elections. It sounds like this. It sounds like that. But they don't read the fine print. The fine print in the Constitution is there is a state of emergency that can be declared if there is a danger. And they say fanaticism, terrorist groups, rebellion are a danger because our population is an uncivilized population. Why do we know that they're an uncivilized population? Because they abuse their free speech. They abuse their democratic voting to vote for fanatic parties, like let's say in Algeria, Islamic Salvation Front or Muslim Brotherhood or Ennahda in Tunisia. So they dissolve the government. They dissolve the elections. So this is a very important aspect of understanding. When one wants to understand liberalism, yeah, it is helpful to read John Locke and Rousseau and Alexis de Tocqueville, or read all of those. But you actually have to look at the actual government policies. Liberalism has a history. Liberalism has a 300-year history. We can actually look at the policies that the paradigmatic liberal nations, Britain, France, Holland, United States, how they've governed themselves domestically and how they've done colonial governance over the past 300 years. And we can see the most famous liberal thinkers standing in favor of things like an unending state of emergency or long-term state of emergency or various limitations on voting and free speech and freedom of association or bans on torture. Like one of the things that people will say sometimes is liberalism bans torture. I mean, this isn't really technically, okay. Yeah, if you have a state of emergency, you can start doing things that ordinarily you wouldn't be able to do otherwise. So I'm not saying that's a good thing or a bad thing, but it is actual history. Like these are the things that if we're actually concerned with the history of liberal governance, we do have to pay attention to these issues. So,
well, your presentation, there's a certain, thought that comes to mind, and you can maybe elaborate on this or maybe correct me. What I'm understanding so far, right, is that we have these terms that seem to be almost kind of invented, right? You have like like you have fanatics, or you have like terrorists, you have extremists, and so on and so forth. And that just seems like if it is from a certain type of hegemony, like let's say a liberal hegemony, then it just becomes a legitimized version of the exact same thing, right? Like because what you're saying is, okay, you have a person like John Stuart Mill, who himself is a colonial administrator, and he wants to, maximize liberty. He wants to maximize freedom. He wants to maximize human happiness. But what he is saying is that I want to maximize your human happiness as per my definition, because you will have liberty as long as you just don't go against the version of happiness that I defined for you. So at that point, it's
exactly.
Yeah, so
you're
kind of circularity in.
Are you saying like this is like a tool which is kind of empty and you can fill it with whatever you want? So somebody
Exactly.
could even use it to push to push like Islam almost, like as long as the policies are pushing things in that direction.
Yeah, I mean, we could say Islam is
Well,
a very liberal religion, just as
Yeah.
long as, you know, you abide by hudud and you abide by Sharia law and so on and so forth,
You
right?
have freedom of speech, but here this is where it becomes hate speech, and the same kind of boundaries.
Well, first of all, people actually have tried to do that. People have said like Islamophobia, like, okay, we're completely okay with free speech, but you can't have Islamophobia, and Islamophobia is like any criticism of Islam. So I mean, you can. So people and all kinds of people use language in this way. But if we were going to like, what would John Stuart Mill say to defend himself? He would say that at the end of the day, I'm restricting freedom, like let's say freedom of speech, freedom of association, freedom to participate in elections, because my sincere goal is to maximize freedom as much as possible over time. But if we talk about Muslims, that's not what their real goal is. The real goal of the Sharia is, yeah, the Sharia values freedom to some extent. That's why that there are things called halal, as opposed to haram. That's why we're encouraged to free slaves. There's certainly a level of freedom that the Quran, and whenever the Quran or the Hadith limit our freedom, it's understood as being not a random limitation, but for the sake of achieving some sort of maslahah, some kind of benefit. But the issue is that the Quran and Islam more generally don't only value individual freedom. They value things like establishing a relationship with God, cultivating a relationship with God. And that means that you should remember God, for instance, by praying 5 times a day and making dhikr. And it means that you shouldn't focus completely on chasing worldly pleasures. So maybe there's Ramadan, which teaches you to go ahead and control your nafs, to control your desires for food and drink and sex. And that helps you focus and develop. And you should remember, you should read the Quran, and the Quran reminds you of all of the ni'am, all of the blessings that God has given you, your health, your wealth, your family. And when you recall those blessings, it develops a love of God and kind of strengthens the relationship. You also have to have a good relationship with your parents. You'll bir al-walidain. You have to take care of them in their old age, and children should obey their parents, and parents should take care of their children. They should give them love. They should give them nafaqah. The husband and wife have all kinds of duties to one another. The husband has the right of being qawam, and the wife has the duty of certain duties of fidelity and child rearing. Now, all of these duties come at the expense of individual freedom. From a liberal perspective, you should maximize individual freedom, even if that means weakening or destroying one's relationship with God, even if that means weakening or destroying one's family, like relationship with one's parents and relatives, even if that means destroying all marriages, even if that means destroying all religious communities or cultural communities. Because when we talk about preserving a culture, a cultural tradition, we're talking about people have an obligation to practice certain festivals and rituals, or preserve a shared language, or recall a shared history. And liberalism says, no, that's not, people shouldn't be required. People shouldn't be obliged to go ahead and take on that duty of, for instance, wearing traditional clothing, using traditional names, speaking one particular language. No, if they want to speak English, they can. They don't have to worry about any of these things. So in this way, liberalism prioritizes individual freedom over relationship with God, relationship with family, relationship with marriage, with your spouse, preserving an overall community, an overall type of identity. And for John Stuart Mill would say, you're pretending that you value, the only thing that you're valuing is freedom. But as a Muslim, that's not the only thing that you value. So for that reason, I don't trust your arguments. And I think he would be right. I don't think that Muslims only value individual freedom. And there are good in the pre-modern world, most societies don't only value individual freedom. They say individual freedom is a fantastic thing, but unlimited freedom causes problems. It comes at major costs. It comes with major costs.
That makes sense. So you're saying if we argue from his perspective, like he was sincere in promoting this kind of thing, and it was structured for it. Whereas if we used it as a tool to promote any sort of ideology or worldview, it would be a hack job, and it wouldn't really be, it wouldn't really be fit for it necessarily.
Yeah, I mean, for instance, how can you say that Islam encourages, how can you say that imposing the Sharia maximizes individual freedom? So, for instance, if you say pray 5 times a day, don't eat during, how does that maximize individual freedom? Like, make the argument.
Yeah.
It's not an easy argument to make.
Yeah,
it's not an easy argument to make because, and John Stuart Mill would say, yeah, it's not an easy argument to make. It involves believing that you want a close relationship with God, and also that there's an additional dimension of reality, the ghaib, that we're not only concerned with this dunya, but we're concerned with the akhirah as well. So
that's true.
Okay, I think I've covered most of the major points. Maybe I can just briefly mention some of the major figures associated. So basically, the colonial governments, they start promoting the reform of schools, Islamic schools. They start controlling who is preaching at the mosques. And they basically want, just like liberal governments wanted reformist Christian thinkers or reformist Hindu thinkers, they also wanted reformist Muslim thinkers. So some of the most famous are like Syed Ahmed Khan, Muhammad Abduh, Ismail Gasprinsky, he's in Russia, kind of Russian Muslim lands. Syed Sheikh al-Hadi, he's in Southeast Asia. They kind of raised this class of religious reformers. One thing that I should point out is whenever we talk about Muslims accepting religious reform, there are always levels of acceptance. So, for instance, the Muslims who are most open, the Muslims who are most receptive to progress, if you have a Muslim reformer who's maximally receptive to progress, he might say, I reject beliefs in demons, I reject slavery, I reject blasphemy punishments. And then if you have someone who's slightly more resistant to progress, would say, I reject slavery and blasphemy punishments, but I still believe in demons. I'm not going to interpret that away. And then if you have a Muslim reformer who's even less receptive to progress, he says, yeah, I accept some progress, I reject slavery, but I still believe in demons and I still believe in the validity of blasphemy punishments. So when it comes to liberal progress, it's not either accept all or reject all. Most Muslims, wrong or right, they have been convinced that some liberal ideas have value. They go ahead and they say, science is great. I love science. I love technology. I love getting more money. Those are really important things. And you know what? Even if I didn't like technology and I didn't like economic power, if our country does not accumulate science and technological power, we are going to be permanently colonized and dominated by countries that do develop science and technology, like European countries. This is what Jamaluddin al-Afghani said. So we really don't have a choice one way or the other. We have to think more scientifically. And then in terms of liberal values, many Muslims have said actually, and for good reason, I mean, I think that there is lots of actually empirical psychological evidence that all human beings universally do value freedom and equality. These are universal values. Now, I think that they're not the only values. I think in traditional Muslim, Christian, Buddhist, Hindu societies, yeah, those things are valued, but family and religion and these other things are valued as well. There's kind of a balance between them. But the fact that all human beings value freedom and equality to some extent has meant that many Muslims in the pre-modern and modern era have looked at liberal human rights norms and said, okay, this makes a lot of sense. This is compelling. So you've always had, not only among secular Muslims, of which, to be honest, there are many very liberal secular Muslims. They say, I'm a secular Muslim. I don't care about religious rules to begin with. Let's put them aside. Even Muslims who say, I'm not a secular Muslim, I'm not a cultural Muslim, I am a Muslim who will follow whatever can be proven comes from Allah and His Messenger, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. I'm going to follow that. I'm going to follow all of that. Even they have adopted some degree of civilizational progress and have reinterpreted religious teachings in a way that they were never understood by pre-modern Muslims. That's something that we have to be honest about. That's an honest description of this situation. I'm not asking you to like it or dislike it, but it is a fact. And this affects education and what's taught in educational institutions across the world.
Also, like,
so yeah, those
there has to be
there
has to be, like, I think, a line between, what is what is actually religious reform in the light of, let's say, geopolitical conditions, compared to what is religious reform in the light of progress. Progress meaning that, just the progression of time. I don't mean progress in the sense that it's generally used as a kind of civilizational shift, but we do have to accept, for example, that Islam does allow some level of progression when it comes to fiqh, right? Like, for example, in aspects of fiqh, when there's new forms of currency, how do we deal with them, right? At what point does it get considered as some kind of currency? Similarly, like, as we have medical advancements, there is going to be bioethical issues, new discussions that will take place. Like, for example, even what is the definition of life? What is the definition of death? Right? These are kind of newer discussions that have been happening after some point onwards, and maybe have come back to light in light of many kind of ethical discussions that we're having. So there's one realm, which is basically the realm of fiqh. There's some kind of plasticity. There's some kind of flexibility in the sense of its application. It'll never really come to an end, and we can never really say that the scope of fiqh, the scope of Islamic law as it was in the time of the Prophet ﷺ, will always remain that same scope, just because we'll have, like, modern means of transportations, we'll have modern financial tools, financial products that are offered, and so on and so forth. So we'll have to kind of analyze those things through the lens of fiqh. However, I do think you make a great point into understanding from what angle does a person approach these discussions, right? So yes, fiqh does allow the room to discuss what are these new progresses and how do we adjust to them. But if we are basing our discussion, or if we're making the principle of our discussion for the adjustment or for the assimilation in light of geopolitical conditions, that's when it becomes maybe reformist, right? Otherwise, we can't really call, like, any kind of change reform. There has to be some kind of boundaries or lines.
Or even like
yeah,
what you're saying, like, if I understand correctly, is like the framework, the traditional framework itself is geared to allow for change in the future. But the problem is when the framework itself, we try to change the framework itself to allow for certain changes that it wouldn't otherwise allow. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there is a realm of change in the framework, but that change is siyasa sharia. It's not the sharia itself. Like, it's the things that are not spoken of by the sharia. I should also note that, ultimately the project of progress leads to the destruction of all cultures and the human race itself. This is also, I'm not saying that's a good thing. I'm not saying it's a bad thing. It's often discussed under the heading of transhumanism, because basically, if you say you want people to have as much freedom as they want and to be as wealthy as they want, you get into a situation where you want people free to change their gender or their species, and they shouldn't have any social stigma. There should be technologies. People should be free to use pharmaceuticals or cybernetic implants to go ahead and increase their IQ or their lifespan or their memory capacity, their language capacity. Little by little, this leads to the exercise of unlimited free choice in a situation of ever increasing technology, means that people will, through these free choices, gradually replace themselves and become increasingly unrecognizable. And this is what is referred to as a transhumanism. And many people will say within 100 to 200 years, the human race will be over as a result of these technologies and increasing freedom. And on top of that, if anyone said no, like let's say hypothetically, let's say someone invented artificial wombs. They said, okay, in reality, we can go ahead, and they are working on artificial wombs, so that we can go ahead and raise a baby in a vat. We don't have to have a woman carry the baby to term. You could have a society, they would say, you could very much imagine a situation where they say the government should actually ban, just as they banned child marriage, just as they've banned some of these other practices like foot binding, they should ban natural birth, because this leads to, it causes certain women to die. It also is, it also produces a situation of great gender inequality where women are expected to be pregnant and care for young children and men aren't. So either it needs to be banned, or at least it needs to be heavily stigmatized to the fact that we can remove natural birth from a society. And maybe also we need to remove sadness from society, maybe through antidepressants. Maybe people in the past, you say, no, sadness is good, suffering is good. It helps us remember our dependence on Allah, and that we're not all powerful. Someone might say, no, this is a type of barbarity. This is a type of backwardsness. People should be free to basically take a type of heroin that doesn't destroy their body. So imagine you had a type of heroin that didn't kill you. There's a famous book by Aldous Huxley, Brave New World, where they're developing these new pharmaceuticals. And pretty soon you can have a society where the individuals don't have any kind of recognizable human behavior, recognizable human lifestyles, but they basically alter their way out of existence. Islam, precisely due to its inflexibility on certain issues, does stand in the way of that. So that's part of this complex situation that one has to deal with. So on the one hand, I would agree that there is flexibility when it comes to the Sharia, especially in the realm of siyasa Sharia, which is determined on the basis of maslaha considerations generally. And you can have various laws like traffic laws or health laws altered over time. But in terms of the core Sharia doctrines, once you open, one should just be aware. One should be aware whether one accepts this argument or not. But once you open the door to changing those doctrines, the question is always where you're going to stop changing the doctrines. And what we see historically over time is when you open the door to things like maslahat mursala, the doctrines are changed one by one. First, the government laws go, then the criminal laws go, then the commercial laws go, then the family laws go, then the rituals go, then the beliefs go, and you have a type of perennialism. And this is a progressive process of secularization. This is the reality. And it's a reality that we know not on the basis of theory, but we've seen it across the world over the past 200 years. This is how religions are secularized.
Jazakallah khair. This is a fascinating conversation that's going on, and I hate to say that we've come up on, we're getting close to the 2-hour mark. So inshallah, I think if Dr. Arya wants to put any concluding information here at the end of this session, we could do that right now, inshallah, before we close off this first episode.
Yeah. Okay. The question that all human beings have to deal with is the question at the heart of modernity is, what should we do about this liberal ideology of progress? To what extent is it morally good to accept this type of civilizational progress? especially given the fact that it leads to the elimination of all religious and cultural traditions and ultimately threatens to eliminate the human race itself. How do we grapple with that? How do we grapple with the fact that if we just say, no, we don't accept progress at all, then we're in a situation where how we're going to build enough scientific and technological and economic power to defend one's lands and not be dominated by Western states. That's something that Muslims over the past 200 years have grappled with. Also, how to deal with the fact that, you know, there are things that we can't sweep under the rug. So if we really accept the view that we should not change any of the Sharia rules, especially those which there is a consensus on, that means, for instance, that there is slavery, that there are blasphemy punishments, that there are these things. This is something that we have, that these are things that, you know, need to be thought about openly, or need to be thought about carefully. And then you say, okay, we'll just eliminate these rules. Let's just interpret away these particular rules. Well, then all of a sudden you're on a slippery slope. And the question is, where do you end? And historically, things haven't come to an end. So I actually don't have any solution to all of this. I don't have solutions to solving these key problems of modernity. Or maybe I have, you know, certain ideas. But I think one thing that's important to do is to fully recognize the challenges that the human race faces, that people following all religions and cultural traditions across the world face, and especially the Muslims face it, because these are not simple problems. They're very complex problems. But the first step to any kind of solution is to be informed about what exactly is being faced. Because 99% of people don't even get the first step. They want to start talking about solutions and strategies and the costs and the benefits of different options, and they don't even understand the past 200 to 300 years of human history, and they want to get involved in these discussions. So the first step is to understand these different.
It reminds me of a quote by Einstein, where he says that if I had an hour to solve a problem, I'd spend 55 minutes understanding the problem and 5 minutes thinking about the solution. So we're doing the reverse, you know. We're thinking, we're understanding for 5 minutes, and the rest we're solutioning.
Yeah, that's a great point.
Jazakumullah khairan.
Okay, so we can.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Arya. This was a wonderful episode, and we look forward to having you on for the next episode. And inshallah, to the viewers, thank you so much for watching. And just a reminder to hit the like button and subscribe, and leave any comments that you may have. And inshallah, we'll see you next time. Take care. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.